Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for waiting. Just, I mean, I think one of the things that will hopefully I'll be able to kind of show in this lecture is give you an explanation why I have to spend my time between 4 different hospitals in 1 week as part of the design of this war, which targets the health system. So go ahead, Tarek, and let's start.
Thank you very much, Ghassan. I know there's been people waiting. This is hopefully we'll only have you on screen, and as opposed to having a look at me. We go back a very long way, Ghassan and I, and this idea of the weaponization of health and Israel's assault on Gaza and Lebanon, and the path to self-destruction of the very people who are causing this attack has been Israel. We have been discussing for quite a long time. In a sense, it's Ghassan himself is not a stranger to conflict of our discussions, Ghassan, in terms of what you yourself have endured and seen, the horrors, and more importantly, what you have exposed to the world in terms of both within Gaza and here in Lebanon. This lecture, for those who will be watching afterwards, is part of our series, Imagining the End of after Zionism, Imagining the Rebirth of Palestine, in a sense that we had a previous one, and just for people who are joining us, that received almost 100,000 views. And in this lecture, we have my class students who are looking at an imaginative alternative to the horrors that they face, and the importance of imagination, in a sense, for us is to imagine another world. For without that, how are we going to reach it? So I have many questions, Ghassan, but I'm sure your lecture will give us those. Why are you running around? Why are they Israel destroying Gaza? Why are they specifically attacking the health infrastructure? And amongst us, we have friends, and including my students' friends, have been lost in the paramedics. So if I will leave it to you now to take over, and then we will take questions live. At the moment, we're only going live on Facebook. Later on, the lecture will be available on YouTube, and we'll hopefully transcribe and publish it in due time. Ghassan Abu Sitta, thank you so much for joining us. And to all those who've been sitting patiently, please forgive us for delays. And maybe you can take over and explain why the design of the war has created this situation for us. Ghassan Abu Sitta.
Thank you very much, Tariq, and thank you for taking the time to listen in and watch this lecture. I think what we need to do is try to understand what has happened since, really, if you want to find an arbitrary point, the 17th of October, 2023, when Israel bombed Al Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza, heralding, in my opinion, a new era in the conduct of war in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, where the majority of the world's population is urban, in the 21st century, where the overwhelming majority of the world's population, at least in the south, but in great sectors in the north, are facing the threat of being deemed as surplus populations by global capital, and therefore what we see in the north having health withdrawn from them, and what we see in the south having life withdrawn from them. And so what we now have come to understand as the Gaza template is the way that the dismantlement of the provision of health is a central component of the conduct of war, initially in Gaza, but now also in Lebanon. And the reason I use the dismantlement is really because it goes beyond what we had seen in the past, where health facilities were targeted, but in a kind of haphazard way, rather than in a systematic dismantlement. And so the systematic dismantlement is that you attack the buildings, the infrastructure, you attack the health workers, you attack the access of the patients to the health facilities, and you attack the infrastructure of public health, which has had a major impact on human health in the last 100 years, which is water and sewage treatment, which is improvement in the quality of housing. So you create a catastrophe where you take away the components of advancement that have happened, that has improved people's health in the 20th century and the 21st century. So in Gaza, what had started with the attack on Ahli Baptist Hospital, with the bombing of the hospital, and then the bombing of 3 children's hospitals in the north, and then the attack on Shifa Hospital, and the whole narrative of militarization and criminalization of Shifa Hospital, with the whole story of underground tunnels, and then the killing and the intentional targeting of health workers. And soon there's a paper that's going to be coming out that shows that if you're a health worker in Gaza, the chances of being killed are 3 times that of the general population. So it's obviously that you're being targeted if you're a health worker. And the destruction of water and sewage treatment plants and people's homes to force them into unsanitary, cramped conditions to generate injury. All of this is now in the modern world, if we kind of call this the modern world, in the post-Second World War world, is a critical component of making a place uninhabitable. And so in order to make Gaza uninhabitable, you need to do this so that you can drive away the population either through ethnic cleansing or through genocidal erasure. And the same in South Lebanon. And by South Lebanon, I don't mean south of the Litani, I mean south of the Awali River. So everything beyond Saida. And the reason why that is necessary is that the Israeli or the Zionist project, having undergone a crisis with this these unending cycles of Palestinian resistance and Lebanese resistance, came to the conclusion that, and we saw this in the writings of people like Benny Morris, came to the conclusion that successful settler colonial projects were successful because they wiped out the indigenous population. And that the biggest threat and the biggest mistake that Zionism has created and made in 48 and again in 67 was to allow parts of the population to remain in the areas it occupied. And that the solution is that Israel should never occupy a people, should always occupy empty lands. And that's what we saw in Gaza, and that's what we're seeing in Lebanon. The other issue, and that is what people do not understand, is that there's also the reason behind this dismantlement of the components of life is that there is a decision to sociologically change those sectors of indigenous population that Israel deems eternally troublesome. So Gaza, with continuous waves of different resistance movements under different names, under different ideologies. South Lebanon, with different generations of different resistance movements under different ideologies. These two, to quote Tony Blair's description of fighting crime. You fight crime and you fight the causes of crime. You fight resistance and you fight the societies that create resistance. And these are the Palestinians in Gaza, particularly, and in the West Bank in the refugee camps, and in South Lebanon, the inhabitants of South Lebanon, so that you permanently alter that those societies that continuously have been fighting against the Zionist project since it was created. And so what we've seen in Lebanon since the war has begun is a dismantlement and not an attack on the health system. And so what has happened is one of the advances that we've seen in trauma care in our societies, in Gaza and in Lebanon, is this emergence of the trauma pathway. So you look after the patient when they're injured, you take them to what's called the trauma stabilization point, you stop the bleeding, and then you take them from there to a field hospital where you do the emergency surgery and you really stabilize the patient, and only then do you take them to a hospital. And that has been shown in the US Army, the British Army in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in Gaza during the marches of return, to improve mortality, to increase survivability. And so what has been happening here is that Israel has attacked the ambulances and then attacked the field hospitals and the trauma stabilization points, killing doctors and paramedics in these, and then attacked the frontline hospitals. So 4 in the south have been attacked, and another 4 have become almost inaccessible to patients. So we've had Barjayoun, Tinin, Salah Ghandour bombed around them so that they are no longer usable. And then when you look at the hospitals in Sur Government Hospital and the Italian hospital, Israel has been bombing access to these hospitals to try to prevent patients getting there so that they would disappear. And then further down the chain of the trauma pathway, the bombing of Bahman, of Rasul, the criminalization of Sahel through the creation of this narrative about tunnels, and Zahra has taken out almost 500 beds out of the health system in Beirut. And so the whole pathway has been taken apart, and the health workers have been killed as part of the dismantlement. And then the kind of catastrophization, the creation of a public health catastrophe through the displacement of 1.25 million people, so that they all move into these internally displaced places, which become rife with infectious diseases, and then you create the same cycle that you're creating in Gaza. And so we see that this is now a tried and tested model that the Israelis will roll out as a critical component. And so what we see in the Lebanese health system, which was already a dysfunctional health system, it was a dysfunctional health system despite the outward appearance, because 85% of it was private. Most of the hospitals, with the exception of the large teaching hospitals, are small and medium-sized family-owned hospitals, with the public health sector being almost non-existent, except in the format of empty, barely functioning hospitals that the donors had built but had never thought of how to maintain them. And so when you took out all of the hospitals that I've spoken about, you end up with patients in these localities with no ability to treat them, because they are in hospitals of opportunity rather than in hospitals of design, i.e. there's no longer a system. They are in whatever hospitals you can find beds for them. And so what we've ended up having to do is run around these different hospitals trying to operate on these patients and trying to provide the care that they needed, because the whole system has had a big shark bite chunk taken out of it. And so it can no longer function properly. So the question is, other than making South Lebanon uninhabitable and Gaza uninhabitable, and other than sociologically changing those communities that have been at the forefront of resistance, whether in Palestine or in Lebanon, what else does this war tell us about the Zionist project as a settler colonial project? For me, and this is probably because of where my vantage point is as a plastic and reconstructive surgeon looking at the destruction of the human body. What I see is that what differentiates settler violence from other forms of political violence is that settler violence and settler colonial violence needs to be performative. There are views and points and where you look at an act of violence, an Israeli act of violence, and there's no political, military, or security benefit that this act of violence has bestowed on the Israelis. It's almost like the violence needs to be relieved of any utilitarianism so that it becomes violence for violence's sake. And we've seen that in Gaza, the killing of the premature babies in Gaza. We've seen that in Lebanon, the killing of multiple families in Lebanon, the killing of the paramedics in Baalbek. All of these, you think, is it worth the $120,000 missile that they fired? The answer is that's what differentiates settler colonial violence. The need to be performative and therefore free of utilitarianism, free, unadulterated violence for violence's sake. And so we see that in the victims, we see that in the targets, and we see that in the treatment of the patients that we have been seeing. When you drop a bomb the size that was dropped on Basta neighborhood, when you drop a bomb the size of the bombs that have been dropped on empty buildings in Bahia in the last few nights, you realize that there's a kind of, there's a performance of violence that is necessary. And therefore, that violence is critical to settler colonialism. The other component that's very central to settler colonialism is the fact that settler colonialism sees the body of the indigenous population as the battleground. And so that body, the human body of Palestinians and Lebanese, is viewed by the Israelis in itself as a battleground where it fights. And so we saw in the marches of return, the demonstrations that happened in Gaza between 2018 and 2020, Israel shot 8,000 Palestinians in the legs with sniper guns, not with the aim of killing them, but with the aim of maiming them. And again, in the pager attack, you saw how it was very easy for Israel to increase the explosive in the pager so that it becomes lethal. But it was critical for Israel that these explosives were not, by and large, lethal, but actually aimed to mark and to maim the victims, over 4,000, in the face, in the eyes, in the hand. And because what the settler needs to do is to claim the body of the indigenous population as part of the settler omnipotence. It's that kind of almost God-like omnipotence that European settlers have always brought to the indigenous populations and have used violence on the settler, on the indigenous body, in the form of maiming and wounding as a mark of ownership, almost like the branding of slaves or the marking or the scalping of indigenous natives in North America, or the stories of indigenous settlers in Australia hunting Aborigines for sport. All of this continues in the 21st century because Israel is, at the end of the day, a European settler colonial project that has its ideological roots in the 1800s, the same way that these other settler colonial projects had their way. And so what health sees and what the health system sees and tries to undo is this mutilation of the human body through the treatment and the surgery. And what the attacks on the health system are trying to stop is the undoing of the marking of the indigenous body through mutilation and through injury and through destruction. And so the war on the health system will continue as long as the war on the indigenous populations of this area continue. And health will continue as part of the indigenous resistance to the necropolitics of this war, i.e. the politics of healing as a resistance to the politics of death, and the politics of medical liberation as described by Che, or described by Fanon, or described by many of the other writers, as a critical component of our resistance to settler colonial violence and its mutilation and its attack on the indigenous body. So I'll stop there, and so that we can have more space for discussions.
Thank you very much for that, Ghassan. Perhaps I'd like to ask you a question, and then let my students have patiently waited. Is the second part, the first of the premise that settler colonialism must have a performative thing. It wants the land, it's learned from its own mistake in this case. It wants the land, it wants to perform its brutality, to show its muscle, to show its killing, its brutality. But how does all this link to its own demise?
Because once defeated, it can no longer go beyond death. So that's one of the interesting things about what the Israelis do, that you see that somehow the Israelis, at the point of death, it doesn't seem to be enough. And so you see them attacking cemeteries in Gaza. You see them attacking the dead in the West Bank by refusing to hand back the bodies of Palestinians to their families that they can be buried. And so the question is about tomorrow, not where does Gaza go after tomorrow, or where does South Lebanon go after tomorrow? Where does Zionist project go after genocide? What can it do? Where does it? And my point is, that's it. It's reached the end of the road. Death is not enough for it. It tried to go beyond death, and it's not enough for it. And now it's going to once defeated in its ability to erase the indigenous population, it will eat itself up.
That, thank you for that. That's a mindful to think about. And we'll give the first set of questions to the students who are in this lecture, who waited very patiently, and we'll take other questions later on. So I'll open the floor to my students. Please speak, unmute yourself and ask your question to Ghassan.
Yes, hello, doctor.
Yeah, hello.
I have a question. So, about the ending of Israel and how you said it's going to end. I just don't think I'm that hopeful that after a genocide, it's going to just eat itself up, as you said. Could you maybe specify some actual factors that consist of this eating up, like that could happen within Israel, and how you view that coming to the end?
So every state, and the settler colonial state of Israel is no different than any other state, has founding myths. It needs founding myths to justify the rule of the political elites and their position. One of Israel's, and these founding myths are critical. So in the Arab world, a lot of Arab regimes that came to power after 1948, one of their founding myths is that they're here to fight Israel and to resist and to liberate Palestine. And they've managed to continue on the fight, the myth, because it's critical to the legitimacy of the ruling elite. Whether it's true or not is inconsequential. They're critical to the legitimacy of the ruling elite. Israel's founding myths about the importance and the centrality of Jewish life, and that Israel would do anything to save the lives of its citizens and of its soldiers, Israel has had to openly jettison, which means that the day after the war, the political elite is going to have to rule over a people that it has informed that it does not care about their lives. It doesn't care about their lives as hostages. The Israeli population is now fully aware of the decision that any attempt at taking Israelis prisoners triggers a protocol where everybody's killed, the captors and the captives. So all of this sanctity of Jewish life in the eyes of the Israeli state has been thrown out the window. Two, with regards to Israel's obsession that it is able, out of technological power, to overwhelm all of its foes. So suddenly it still finds itself in Gaza fighting against handmade, homemade weapons and still being unable to defeat them. Three, Israel in 1948 was built on the idea that through massacres, you can frighten the Palestinians to leave their country. And what failed during this genocide is that, and we still see Palestinians in the north of Gaza despite all of the massacres. So the founding myths of the state and its ability to rule over its citizens has been completely jettisoned by the state, which means that this is a state that is not thinking about tomorrow. This is a state that now is literally fighting for the survival of this project, and that it no longer has the luxury of planning for the day after. Two, the most important thing about that differentiates Israel from any normal state is that Israel is a project. It's not just a state, it's a project. It is a project which, as every settler colonial project is, an extension of Western imperialist power in the region. And that Western imperialist power, to function through Israel, we discovered that Israel has to be feared, which brings us back to the need for performative violence. We now realize that all of the massacres that have happened were not excesses by Israel, but actually by design, they had to be acts of performative brutality, which is critical to Israel being able to fulfill its function in the region of policing through fear and terror the indigenous populations of this region. And so Qana was not an excess, it's by design. It's as important to the conduct of war, the massacre. Sabra al-Shatila is as important, Qana is as important. Every massacre is an important because it's the ultimate act in performative violence. And that performative violence is necessary for settler omnipotence that is used to rule over the indigenous population. And so all of these tools by which Israel used to rule us, and the Israelis used to be ruled by the ruling elites in Israel, have been jettisoned in this war. And so the question is, who then and how is Israel going to function after this? It's no longer feared, or it's convinced that it's no longer feared by those populations that it's supposed to be brutalizing, and so can no longer function through fear. And its population are no longer being made to feel that they're somehow a unique and protected group, rather than like every settler in the history of humanity. They are at the service of the metropole, and they are at the service of the colonial masters that created the settler colony. And they are the dispensable ones, and not the colonial powers that created these settlements.
Thank you for that very detailed answer, Ghassan. And thank you, Angie, for a very good question. Nancy, you have a question for Ghassan.
Yeah, hello, doctor. Thank you for your time. You've provided profound information and data about the healthcare sector. But I wanted to ask about something very specific. As we all know, and this may sound a bit redundant, but we can see the huge psychological impact on the population, and especially on the healthcare workers, and how Israel uses criminal psychological warfare. So I'm just curious to know, what can you tell us about that and the situation going forward from here into the unknown future? So like, how can the survivors of this genocide and atrocious crimes move forward after that?
I think it's really something that I have thought about, and because Tariq is very, very old, and I'm slightly less old than Tariq, unfortunately have to live through, and hopefully your generation doesn't live through, is one of the problems that we have faced as a generation, is that the political elites in the Arab world of our generation and our parents' generation have always sold through propaganda defeats as if they are either a temporary setback, as in the case of the 1967 war, or that they're victories, as in the case of the 1982 war. And therefore, in this collective culture and subconscious of the peoples of this region, we do not appreciate that even now, even with the heavy price that we have paid in Gaza and the heavy price that we have paid in Lebanon and will pay, the price of defeat will be much higher than the price that we have paid and we would pay by continuing our resistance to this genocidal erasure. In 1982, when the Palestinians were defeated in Lebanon, they paid the price immediately in Sabra and Shatila. Then we paid the price in Lebanon in the 1980s through this kind of explosion of futile wars. We then paid the price in the destruction of the Palestinian political project and the PLO and its corruption and its corrosion. And the 82 defeat led to the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement is related to 1982. Losing, defeat, has a much higher price than resistance, regardless of what high a price resistance entails. And therefore, that's one of the things that our generation has never been forced to accept, that somehow it's not feasible to lose, because the price will be another 2 or 3 decades of catastrophe. And that's why, regardless of what the situation is now, we have to win. We have to win. It's not a political statement. I'm telling you, as a utilitarian, pragmatic statement, there is no alternative to victory, because defeat means decades of continuous loss and continuous consequences of that defeat. And victory at least then allows you to heal. There is no healing in defeat. Once you are defeated, you are in a continuous state of wounding and injury, whether it's mental health, whether it's the Vietnamese only started to heal after they won. The Algerians only started to heal after they won. Not while they were, had they lost, they would not have healed. Actually, we see that those nations in the South that were defeated, they started to eat themselves internally, either through civil war or through the kind of criminalization of violence, which eats societies from the inside. There is no alternative to victory. It's not a luxury. Victory is a necessity if there's going to be any life left in this region. And only then will healing start.
Thank you, Ghassan. I think that's a very profound statement, class, that there is no alternative to victory, because in defeat, there is no healing, and without healing, there is no life. And without life, what else is left? So in a sense, Ghassan, we tried to organize it, but we lost a lot of time earlier on. Jana, are there any questions from outside that you would like to pose to Ghassan?
No, there's not.
Any of you students want to ask any other questions? I think, Ghassan, otherwise me and you will end up talking to ourselves, and we can do that on another occasion. Thank you very much for that. What we'll do, there's a lot in there that needs expanding at a later stage, Ghassan. We'll get it all transcribed, and perhaps you could then edit it down, edit it up, and we'll include some more of the questions. Anyway, thank you very much, Ghassan.
Thank you.
And you made it. What happened? What was the delay?
Oh no, one of the cases had to go. We have, as you know, since the war in Lebanon started, we started bringing in more of the children from Lebanon for reconstructive surgery, because Lebanese law only obliges hospitals to provide the initial treatment, but not the reconstructive surgery. And so, as a Ghassan of Sitta Children's Fund, we've been bringing more and more kids for reconstructive surgery to Beirut. And unfortunately, I spend the first, until 3 o'clock, I'm in the Hariri hospital, running a clinic for around 70 to 80 patients, because that's where the wounded are coming. And then I come here to do these cases that are pending. And so it's not always easy to kind of maneuver. And because of the crisis in Al Hamra, where just traffic has come to a complete halt from the sheer number of cars parked in Al Hamra, my movement has become more and more difficult. So tomorrow I'm in a different hospital, and then I'm going to Sitta to another hospital. And then Wednesdays and Thursdays, I'm in a third hospital. And Fridays, I'm in a hospital in Al Hadath, which is the last hospital in Dahi that's still seeing patients.
Okay, Ghassan, I'll let you go. You must be exhausted. And hopefully
thank you so much. And thank you everyone for making the time.
Thank you very much. That you've given us a lot to think about. And be safe, and I'll see you soon.
Take care.
Thank you, Doctor, for your time.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you,
Doctor.
Yeah, Hannah.
Thank you.